Depending on who you ask, the Sega Saturn is either a system full of treasures or it isn't really worth your time outside of a few notable entries. No matter which side of that fence you sit on, I'm here to tell you may want to check out Astal, and probably not for the reasons you have heard before. So Astal is an action platformer developed and published in-house by Sega that was released in 1995. A sort of launch title that depends on how you frame a launch of a video game system, with Astal coming out from 4 to 5 months in that window for each region. It was a game that was very needed in the US, and there weren't a lot of games for that very sudden late spring Saturn launch. It is usually praised for its wonderful sprite work, hand-drawn animations for cutscenes, voice acting, and a killer soundtrack. That is usually where the praise stops, and where it also stopped when it was released in 1995. GamePro in their November 95 issue had this to say: Astal looks good, but the short stages and repetitive hopping and bopping don't give the game much replay value. A good rental and a weekend's work, but not much more. It's all that's required for this crystal cutie. Do I feel like that's an accurate statement? Yes and no, honestly. As I'll talk about in this video, Astal does a lot of things right for the type of game I really enjoyed now and in 1995. But it also does a lot of things only kind of right. As I already mentioned, the cutscenes in this are just fantastic. One of the best parts of CD gaming at the time, especially with Sega and Hudson, was the wonderful animated intros and cutscenes. Astal is no exception. Produced by Tokyo Movie Shinsa, who had a hand in several games for Sega during this time, the animations tell the backstory of our main character Astal, as well as his partner Lita. It is basically an Adam and Eve story with a single creator, in this case the goddess Antua, who created everything from different jewels. I enjoy that our hero Astal is a flawed hero from the start, where his purpose was to protect Lita, but he, as the intro puts it, does too good of a job. His rough and tumble attitude is, and I quote, shameful. Of course, we need a bad guy in all of this, and that brings in Gerardo, who creates Geist. After kidnapping Lita, Astal sets out on his rescue and once again goes too far in his efforts, where he ends up cracking the ocean floor and thus damaging the planet. The goddess awakes, angry at Astal, quickly defeats Gerardo, and then banishes Astal to the moon. We pick up the story from there, and if you didn't or don't have the manual for the game, the next part of the story is not explained very well in the game. You just suddenly start the game as Astal. But apparently, Lita was later captured by Geist, who still existed for some unknown reason. So Astal breaks out, which is why he has broken chains on his arms in the game, and sets out to save Lita in a world less friendly than Astal remembers. There are other animations in the game. First, you have a different intro that plays if you let the game sit at the start screen for too long. This is more similar to an intro of a cartoon, and it's just a wonderful montage with music over it. I would watch things like this all day. There's just something about them. Then you have little storybook style cutscenes with Astal giving some backstory and basically thinking out loud. It kind of fills some of those gaps of the story, but not really. Most of it is left to that manual. I know I just spent a good chunk of time talking about intros and cutscene animations that play a rather small part in terms of the actual game. But like I mentioned, these have a strong presence in the legacy of Astal. They also set a wonderful visual benchmark for the rest of the game. There is no denying Astal has top-tier sprite work, and best of all, there isn't a hard disconnect from what you see in these intros and cutscenes to what is presented once you actually start the gameplay. The detail in all these sprites are simply fantastic. As such, Astal keeps his traits like the chains on his wrists, the crystal on his chest, and even good detail in his hair and eyebrows. On top of that, the animation is smooth and clean. There are also foreground and background tiles with parallax scrolling, and both are done very well. I never really find them distracting. They serve their purpose and call attention to the right things rather than make it hard to focus on anything. There are even little bonuses to be found in those layers, such as light rays poking through the clouds, waterfalls, or the volcanoes actually erupting in time with what happens in the foreground. It's not all perfect. Some of the layers get kind of bland, and some of the effects are kind of forced, such as making the whole background wave around to reference heat. I think the most impressive is the sprite scaling, and not only for Astal, but all the enemies for entire levels. I love watching enemies pop up in the foreground or background to flip up in front of Astal, or the smooth zoom out for levels and items when you need a better view of what's going on. Plus the game runs like a top, and the Saturn handles it all like a champ. It is really a smooth running game, and really, that is the most important part a lot of the time. Now I mentioned that soundtrack, and they really did something special here, especially for 1995. Astal takes a very movie score approach to its soundtrack. While not crazy uncommon to hear more orchestrated music in video games thanks to the CD format, Red Book audio, and the like, Astal stands out to me because it doesn't just keep the usual style, but change the instruments. Rather than use some sort of rock-style instrumentation or just upping its game in terms of synthesized instruments and samples, Astal explores several styles in its compositions. Of course, you have that lovely opening cinematic, which has lyrics in Japan, by the way, which is immediately contrasted by a sweeping orchestral-style piece for the first level. Giant timpani rolls with a strong string section, French horns, and all the cymbal crashes one could ever ask for. Give it a quick listen. By contrast, other levels have more muted or atmospheric compositions, and then later there are even some that have a crunchy, almost metal guitar in the background. But it still keeps that very movie score vibe with piano, strings, percussion, and the like in the background even when something else comes forward. I really feel like you could go see a pops band or a local symphony play this soundtrack. I'm honestly surprised it doesn't come up more often. So let's address the elephant in the room, the gameplay, the level design, and the actual enjoyment you get out of playing Astal. I said the visual presentation and design has historically been praised, with the gameplay being a footnote of sorts. I can see why in some regards, but I don't think, and this might not surprise you, that it's completely fair take. Astal doesn't fit neatly into one genre. You have at the core a platformer where you move from left to right, jumping over obstacles, and some levels really lean into it. We'll get to that if it's a good thing or bad in a bit. But there is also a light beat-em-up mechanic. While Astal can jump on some enemies, it never is an attack. It's all defensive. Instead, Astal fights his enemies using a grab, a throw, and a big fist smash. It's an interesting change of pace for a game like this, where I feel like most others would be a standard platformer or have some sort of magic or weapon-based attack. The grab and throw is your standard choice of attack. You just walk up to an enemy, grab them by the throat, and toss them aside. It isn't any more complicated than that, and that's kind of a good thing. I don't think the general aesthetic of the game would benefit from having some complicated fighting mechanic. But you can jump in the air and smash down with your fists, or press down and do it in place for a little variety. Usually great for faster moving enemies, or of course, ones in the air. If a big obstacle gets in the way, Astal can hulk out and lift it and toss it aside and into enemies, really showing off those sprite scaling effects I mentioned earlier. There's also Astal's Superman style breath, but it doesn't get used very often. Really only needed in the fire section. Or maybe there is a better strategy, but I'm just not seeing it. Unfortunately though, these mechanics can sometimes feel kind of clunky, making that reach for an enemy not always connect the way I want it to. The grab going right through an enemy, or a fist smash just hitting air. Also sometimes just had an issue with Astal not picking up the obvious item I was trying to pick up. He would just kind of hold it there. Jumping is a little rough too. Astal's jump and the gravity that go with it needed a bit more refinement. It can feel like a guessing game how much of a jump Astal will have at any given moment, especially with moving platforms, which made 2 levels extra frustrating. Trying to jump off these falling pillars is almost a gamble. Obviously, it isn't supposed to be easy, but it rarely felt like it took skill. It isn't all bad though. I got good at doing these jump chains off of enemies. Also, when you do a fist smash in the air, Astal basically freezes in place, giving you some extra hang time. Funny enough, this game has my hated double tap to run mechanic, which is super surprising since there are plenty of buttons on a Saturn controller. But Astal rarely needs to actually run, and his large stride dramatic walk kind of thing just fits with this general vibe of the game. There is an attack to do after a dash as well, but again, I didn't use it very often. So you've probably noticed this little bird in a lot of the gameplay footage, and that's because in the first level you get this bird as a companion. It's the last mechanic to talk about in Astal, and again, they did something pretty interesting here. In that first level, almost immediately you rescue this bird that Astal just immediately hates for no reason, and that bird becomes your helper though. As you fight enemies, a little meter on the bottom fills up, and you can select one of the crystals above it with the triggers, or by using X, Y, and Z for either an attack, a special move, or to grab you a health item. This mechanic is very useful, and there are several instances that without them grabbing a health item, I wouldn't have beaten a boss or a level. On top of that, they can actually help in boss fights by blocking or destroying certain attacks. They can even hit a platform to pause it in place for you. It isn't always an easy out though, and Astal's friend can come back without a healing item, and the mechanic can be fickle, just simply not doing what I requested in the slightest. You do, for one boss battle, take full control of the bird to rescue Astal. It is a challenging fight and an interesting but sometimes frustrating change of pace. The whole idea is cute as can be though, and their dynamic as friends unrolling as the game goes on is very charming. I do need to mention that you can use the bird as a second player with Astal. It's not something I've explored much, but the option is there. Before I give a kind of overall conclusion, there is one thing left to talk about, and that's the enemies and the bosses, of course. They did a wonderful job creating a cast of creatures and characters that really sell this universe. They remind me of Dark Crystal or the never-ending story a lot of the times. Your most common enemies seem to be what I'm going to call the regular crystal soldiers who you'll just toss aside. They pose little threat. After that is these larger crystal pig-like enemies. They take a little more effort, and by that I mean they just need to be stunned and then tossed aside as well. After that, there are things like bats and these bug-like things which will dive at Astal. But you also have things like the dragons of fire or the big beetle-like creatures in the desert level. They are more than anything set dressing or obstacles, but they do well to build a world. Outside of that, they have the usual fare like spikes and things dropping from the ceiling to try and crush Astal. While these enemies, especially the large, very alien creatures, do a lot of the world building of Astal, none of them are particularly interesting. Very few of them are actually aggressive and mostly just exist in a certain area, almost more of an obstacle than an enemy. Not saying they don't pose a challenge or a threat, but don't expect Astal to actually be a beat 'em up. The bosses are quite different from the normal stage enemies though. They have a personality and can be quite challenging. They're also not typical in their design. Instead, you get this crazy ram-looking thing that you have to try your best at giving it a few sumo tosses. I enjoyed learning the patterns of the bosses and figuring out how to defeat them. They were all very enjoyable. That isn't to say they are the same every time. There is certainly a randomness to their actions. Sometimes you'll just get very lucky and a boss will just rotate the easiest move so you can just quickly take them down. Then of course, sometimes you'd be not so lucky. But even when I struggled, I enjoyed every boss all the way until the epic final battle. Not every one was top-notch, but certainly some are very memorable. So the big question is Astal worth your time and should you check out a physical copy? Well, Astal is a charming experience even with its flaws. I don't think there is any denying that. There's wonderful art direction, amazing soundtrack, and I found myself attached to the characters and the story. That review in GamePro from the start of the episode is not completely incorrect. The actual gameplay does fall short compared to everything else in that game, and there's a reason that does seem to be a common perception. But I certainly don't feel that way myself, that it's a weekend rental and not much more. Yes, you can beat the game in a short span of time. It won't take more than an afternoon if you've got the skills, but it's unlikely that you'll beat it on your first try. You'll replay it right out of the gate, and if you're a fan of the genre, you'll probably just want to be good at the game rather than be satisfied after a first go around. As a side note, the US version differs from the original Japanese release by only giving you one single continue and up to 5 lives. The original version had infinite continues. So if you do struggle with the game or do want that shorter experience, there is a code to put in to unlock 99 lives and a level select. While I don't see myself playing Astal on a whim, I'm certainly not going to file it away and never touch it again. It is definitely a game worth experiencing more than once. So yes, Astal is worth your time. If you're looking for a great Saturn game, just a fan of platformers, or just enjoy games that match this aesthetic. Now, Astal isn't a hidden gem. It is often on lists of Sega Saturn games for various reasons, but I do think it doesn't get a lot of attention for being a good game rather than a collector's piece or an art piece. If you do want a physical copy, it's in the $100 range as of the release of this video, and I wouldn't suggest buying it to play it for the first time. But if you're a big Saturn fan, I'll leave it up to you to decide if this charming piece is worth that price tag. Let me know your thoughts on Astal if you've played it or think you will in the future. I love to hear what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey, this is Kevin. Once again, thanking you so much for watching another episode of RetroActive. If you liked it, please hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, all the stuff I'm supposed to say. And I also want to remind you that I do have a Ko-fi account and a Discord. Links will be in the description. Bye.